Let's take a minute to talk about some of the common characteristics of bias so that we can spot these more easily. Bias often seeks conformity through confrontation. People with deep biases are often adamant that their point of view is the only acceptable position to take, or choice to make, or way to think about that subject. This creates a hyper-emotional environment, and defiance is part of that emotional charge. Scientific evidence or other forms of evidence, such as logic or ideology, that contradict the bias are pushed aside emphatically, with repudiation, and, here's what's key, without addressing the substance of the evidence itself. Then, as friction rises, how can there be any kind of meaningful discussion around the actual facts or the actual evidence that exists? How can a common definition be reached? And once communication breaks down and there's tangible friction in the air, and the tone of what could have been a friendly conversation suddenly becomes very personal and delicate, that's when bias really shows itself. Take a minute to think about a time like this, for you personally, where there was clear tension coming from what started as a simple discussion about some certain topic, but then transformed into something personal, something offensive. To what extreme will biases be defended? To answer that, we have to look at four things. You have to look at the individual, you have to look at the environment, you have to look at the construct of the bias, and you have to look at the sources and goals of the manipulation being applied to the individual. How much self-control does the person have over their own behavior? What is their moral framework? Which principles, behavior, and aspirations are prioritized above others? In terms of environment, what is going on around the individual? Are the biases being reinforced by the masses? Are the claims being amplified by leaders? How was the bias constructed? Over what length of time? And with what frequency or intensity? What is the claim? And what's at stake? What's the recourse for inaction as set by the bias? And what does victory look like? These are important elements that are prevalent and common across many biases. Unfortunately, what it means is that those with less self-control and those with fewer morals, those are the individuals that are capable of actions when defending a bias that others would not consider. It's the same in everyday life. They tend to be the group that gets violent more than others. But what the bias does is it provides an outlet for that behavior. Suddenly, that aggressive behavior has a purpose. There is a claim that needs defending, and that begins the spiral towards extreme behavior. So now that we know a little bit more about bias, how do we get bias in the first place? And how do we get rid of it? Remember, bias is the obstacle to objectivity. So bias is the obstacle to being able to honestly evaluate and assess the facts and evidence tied to events. One key aspect of bias is repetition. If advertisers only had to advertise one time to get an audience to become consumers of their product, it would be a very different world indeed. But it does take repetition. Bias is strengthened through repetition. And often a bias's claim is repeated and repeated and repeated in order for it to take hold and cause others to also believe in the bias. And believing in the claims of the bias, our perspective becomes distorted in a way that separates us from the truth. Let's be very clear, we're not trying to say what the truth is. Instead, we're saying that to live in a state of existence where behavior is driven by bias is to live as a slave to those biases. Biases restrict our freedom to be objective, and they restrict our right as a human to exercise objectivity. The more biases we collect and the more influence those biases have over our behavior, the more difficult it becomes to use objectivity at all. Many athletes agree that the most resistance they face to working out is the moment leading up to when they get started. It's similar with objectivity. It seems like a drag, like more work than we're in the mood for, until we commit and just start the process of being objective. We just commit and keep objectivity in the forefront of our mind. We commit to using it. In some sense, objectivity is an exercise in distraction removal. We remove the paths of action or solutions that are inappropriate or illogical, and then our focus can be narrowed to a smaller set of possibilities. Resistance to objectivity is real. It does take more effort. Just like so many of the best things in life, doing the right thing takes more effort and more courage than settling for something less. When we settle for less, we compromise. Whether we admit to it or not, we face events each and every day where we know that there's a clear path of action or behavior that we should choose. And then there's some other, easier path of action we could take instead. More effort can be any number of things. It can be added risk, or complicated social implications, or just more perseverance that may be needed to see it through. But there is some extra effort and consideration required with that path of action. Ultimately, we weigh our options, make our choice, and navigate down a path of action. How many times do we face that same scenario in a day? It happens when we decide what types of food and beverages we put into our bodies. It happens when we have opportunities for physical activity and sport. It happens when we engage with society, and it happens when we engage with the environment. It happens when we encounter opportunities, and it happens when we suffer losses. What it really comes down to is how well we can assess and evaluate our options, how well we understand ourselves, and how well we can execute on our decision once it's been made. That's why behavior is so much more telling than intentions are. Intentions, like words, are pretty cheap and can be twisted, but behavior is factual. It's the end result of decisions made as time passes.